Close your eyes. Imagine a boy reading a book. Not an ordinary boy, a boy who has been told by his mother that his father is a god, a boy whose tutor is Aristotle, the greatest philosopher alive, perhaps the greatest who has ever lived, a boy who sleeps with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself beside a dagger. The Iliad, Homer's great poem of the Trojan War, the story of Achilles, the son of a goddess and a mortal man, the greatest warrior who ever lived, who chose a short glorious life over a long obscure one, who raged and grieved and fought and died young, and whose name was still spoken centuries later with the reverence due to a god. This boy has decided that he is going to be Achilles. Not metaphorically, not as an aspiration or an ideal. He is going to be Achilles, the divine warrior, the man who changes the world, the figure whose deeds are so extraordinary that history cannot contain them in the normal categories it uses for human beings. His name is Alexander. He is going to keep that promise to himself. In 13 years of campaigning, from the age of 22 to the age of 32, he will conquer an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. He will defeat the largest empire the world had yet seen, the Persian Empire of the Achaemenids, which had stood for 200 years, which governed perhaps 44% of the world's population at its height. He will burn Persepolis. He will stand at the edge of the known world and weep because there are no more worlds to conquer. He will dress as a Persian king and marry a Persian queen and become something that his own generals find increasingly difficult to follow. He will die at 32 in Babylon of a fever, or of poison, or of grief. The ancient sources are not sure. And he will never be forgotten. Tonight we tell his story, all of it, from the boy at Pella to the man in Babylon, from Achilles' heir to the god-king of Asia, from the beginning to the end that came too soon. So settle in, let the night come, let the fire burn low, and let history carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The world Alexander was born into. To understand Alexander, you need to understand two worlds simultaneously. The world he came from, Macedonia, the rough northern kingdom that the sophisticated cities of southern Greece looked down on as semi-barbaric. And the world he was about to destroy, the Persian Empire, which Dan Carlin's Kings of Kings series asks us to understand on its own terms, not as the villain of the Greek story, but as a civilization of genuine magnificence that had been the dominant power of the ancient Near East for 2 centuries. We have already told the story of Cyrus the Great and the founding of the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid dynasty that Cyrus built had, by the time Alexander was born, governed the largest empire in the ancient world for over 200 years. Its administrative sophistication, its religious tolerance, its roads and postal systems and multi-ethnic armies, all of it was genuinely impressive. The Persians had a saying, as preserved by Herodotus, about their own kings. They said that Cyrus was the father, Cambyses the tyrant, and Darius the shopkeeper. Dan Carlin makes the observation that calling Darius a shopkeeper sounds like an insult until you consider the size of the shop he was running. He was running what today we would call a global corporation, a CEO managing an empire of 50 million people. These were not the slavish cannon fodder for Sparta's spears that the Greek traditions sometimes made them. They were a sophisticated, organized, genuinely powerful civilization. And into this world, from a rough northern kingdom, came a 22-year-old who had read the Iliad so many times he could recite it from memory. Macedonia. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom. His father was Philip II, the man who, in the generation before Alexander, had transformed Macedonia from a fractious, threatened kingdom surrounded by enemies into the dominant military power in the Greek world. Philip was extraordinary in his own right. He had reformed the Macedonian army, creating the famous Sarissa phalanx, units of infantry carrying 18-foot spears that had proved unstoppable in battle after battle. He had conquered Thrace. He had defeated Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, establishing Macedonian dominance over the Greek city-states. He had planned the invasion of Persia, and then he was assassinated in 336 BC at the wedding of his daughter by a man who had personal grievances against the court. Alexander was 20 years old. He was now king of Macedonia, commander of the Greek alliance his father had built, and heir to a plan for conquering the Persian Empire. He moved with a speed that would characterize his entire reign. Part 2: The Mother and the Myths. Before we follow Alexander into Asia, we need to spend time with the person who shaped him most profoundly. His mother, Olympias. We have already told her story in full, the princess of Epirus, the devotee of the Dionysiac snake cult, the woman who believed with absolute certainty that her son was the child of Zeus rather than Philip. But her influence on Alexander deserves examination again, because it is inseparable from understanding what drove him. Olympias told her son that he was the son of a god, that Zeus himself had come to her in the form of a snake, and that the child she carried was divine. She was not the first mother to make such a claim. The heroes of Greek mythology, Achilles, Heracles, Perseus, were all sons of gods by mortal women. The divine ancestry was what explained their extraordinary deeds, what justified their demand for a different standard of recognition and reward. Alexander believed it, or he chose to believe it, which amounts to the same thing. When he reached Egypt in 332 BC, he made a deliberate detour to the oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis, a journey of several hundred miles through desert that was genuinely dangerous. He wanted the god's confirmation of what his mother had told him. He received it, or at least he returned from the oracle saying he had received it, and refused to tell anyone what had been said. Whatever passed between Alexander and the oracle in the desert, he came back transformed. He referred to Ammon as his father from that point on. He began to expect a kind of recognition that went beyond what human kings normally received. This was not mere vanity. It was something more complex and more troubling. A man who had been told since childhood that he was divine, who had been educated by the greatest philosopher alive to achieve the impossible, who had read the Iliad so many times that the template of the divine hero was burned into his consciousness, genuinely trying to live up to what he believed about himself. Whether this belief gave him the extraordinary self-confidence that made his conquests possible, or whether the conquests fueled the belief in a feedback loop that eventually spiraled beyond anyone's control, that is one of the great questions about Alexander. It was probably both. Part 3: The Young King. Alexander's first 2 years as king were a demonstration of the qualities that would define his entire reign. Speed, decisiveness, a refusal to be constrained by what the situation seemed to allow. When Philip was assassinated, the edges of the Macedonian kingdom immediately began to test the new young king. Rival claimants to the throne appeared. Thracian and Illyrian tribes on the northern frontier stirred. The Greek city-states that Philip had subdued saw an opportunity. Alexander moved. He suppressed the internal rivals quickly and brutally. He launched a lightning campaign into Thrace and Illyria, covering ground at speeds his enemies considered impossible, arriving before they had time to organize. When news reached the Greek city of Thebes that Alexander had been killed in the northern campaign, a rumor, probably deliberate, the Thebans revolted. They were encouraged, the sources say, with Persian gold. Darius III, the new Persian king, was already working to destabilize his future enemy. Alexander marched south. He covered 300 miles in 13 days. He appeared outside Thebes before the Thebans had fully organized their defenses. He offered terms. The Thebans refused. He destroyed the city. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city, one of the great cities of ancient Greece, the city of Epaminondas, the city that had once humbled Sparta, was razed to the ground. One building was spared, the house of the poet Pindar. Alexander admired poetry. The message was received across Greece. When Alexander marched south to Corinth to receive confirmation of the Greek alliance's leadership, there was no opposition. He was 21 years old. In 2 years he had secured his kingdom, suppressed multiple threats, and established beyond any doubt that he was not his father's cautious, measured heir. He was something different. He crossed into Asia in 334 BC with an army of about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Part 4. The Granicus. The first battle of Alexander's Persian campaign took place at the Granicus River in northwest Turkey in May 334 BC. The Persian satraps of the western provinces had assembled a force to meet him, cavalry and Greek mercenary infantry, positioned on the far bank of the river. Alexander's advisors counseled caution. The river was deep in places, the far bank was held by the enemy, crossing under fire was dangerous. Wait for morning, wait for better conditions. Alexander crossed immediately. He led the charge himself into the water, into the enemy's position, the companion cavalry, his elite horsemen streaming behind him. The Persian cavalry on the far bank tried to hold, tried to cut him down personally. He was struck on the helmet by a sword. He was nearly killed. The line held for a moment, and then it broke. The Persian cavalry fled. The Greek mercenaries on foot were surrounded and massacred. Alexander refused to accept their surrender, reportedly furious that Greeks had fought for Persia against him. The western Persian satrapies fell in rapid succession. Alexander moved down the coast of Asia Minor with a combination of military force and political skill, presenting himself as a liberator of the Greek cities from Persian rule, generally treating the populations of surrendered cities well, installing democratic governments that made him popular with the ordinary people. He visited Troy. He went to the supposed tomb of Achilles. He made offerings. He ran races around the tomb with his closest friend Hephaestion, who ran to the tomb of Achilles' companion Patroclus. The symbolism was entirely conscious. Alexander was Achilles. Hephaestion was Patroclus, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War and his beloved companion, replicated in the greatest warrior of the Macedonian army and his. He kept the Iliad under his pillow. He had come to the place where Achilles had fought. He was beginning to live the story he had been reading since childhood. Part 5. Issus. Darius III, the Persian king of kings, had not yet committed his main army. He had been managing the problem from a distance, using his western satraps, hoping the Macedonian advance would be stopped before it required his personal intervention. By 333 BC, it was clear that it would not be. Darius assembled a massive army, and moved to intercept Alexander. The two forces met at Issus, in the narrow coastal plain of what is now southern Turkey, in November 333 BC. Issus was, in retrospect, a battle that Darius chose poorly. His army was enormous. The ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, from 100,000 to over 500,000, all almost certainly exaggerated. Modern historians estimate perhaps 100,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's 40,000. But the terrain at Issus was narrow, hemmed in between the sea and the mountains. The vast Persian numerical advantage was largely negated. The wings of the enormous Persian army could not outflank the Macedonians because there was simply not enough room. Alexander attacked the Persian line with his usual directness, the companion cavalry on the right wing, the phalanx in the center pressing hard. Darius was in the center of his own line in the traditional Persian position of the king, commanding from a high war chariot. Alexander drove toward Darius. The Persian line broke around the king, and Darius did what he would do again at a larger battle 2 years later. He fled. He abandoned his camp, he abandoned his treasury, he abandoned his family, his mother, his wife, his daughters. Alexander found them in the Persian camp the next morning. He reportedly treated them with extraordinary courtesy. He told Sisygambis, Darius's mother, that he would treat her as a mother. Ancient accounts say she came to regard him as a son and wept when he died. Whether this is embellished, it captures something real about Alexander's approach to the Persian royal family. He was not merely conquering Persia. He was, in his own mind, becoming the legitimate successor to the Persian kings. He needed their dignity preserved, not destroyed. Part 6: Egypt and the Oracle. After Issus, Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius east. He turned south. He moved down the Levantine coast, reducing the Phoenician cities that supplied the Persian navy, cutting off the naval power that was the Persian fleet's lifeblood. Tyre, the great island fortress, refused to submit. Alexander besieged it. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months, from January to July 332 BC. It was an engineering challenge of extraordinary scale, involving the construction of a causeway from the mainland to the island fortress, the assembly of a naval force from surrendered Phoenician and Cypriot cities, and a final assault that breached the walls after months of effort. When Tyre fell, Alexander crucified 2,000 men on crosses along the beach. It was a statement. Tyre had been warned. It had resisted. It had cost Alexander 7 months and significant casualties. The price of that resistance was displayed along the shore for anyone who was considering similar resistance elsewhere. He moved on to Egypt. Egypt surrendered without a fight. The Persian satrap handed over the province. The Egyptians, who had been Persian subjects for 2 centuries, who had chafed under Persian rule, who had their own ancient and proud identity, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He was recognized as Pharaoh. He was hailed as the son of Ammon, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. He went to the desert oracle, and he founded Alexandria, the city he designed on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, laid out, by some accounts, with grain on the ground to trace the streets while the city's plan was formed, would become the greatest city in the world within a generation. The library, the lighthouse, the confluence of Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and every other Mediterranean culture. It would outlast his empire. It would outlast almost everything he built. Part 7: Gaugamela. Darius had not been idle. After Issus, he had retreated east and spent 2 years rebuilding his army. He had learned from the defeats. He chose his ground carefully this time, the plain of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq near the modern city of Mosul. Flat, open ground where his cavalry and his scythed chariots could maneuver freely without the terrain constraints that had hampered him at Issus. He had the ground leveled. He had recruited new troops from every corner of his empire, Bactrian cavalry, Scythians, Indians with war elephants, Armenian and Cappadocian horsemen. He had scythed war chariots, vehicles with blades mounted on the wheels designed to cut through infantry formations. He had, by most estimates, between 250,000 and 1,000,000 men. The exact number is unknowable. Ancient sources are notoriously unreliable on such figures. What is certain is that he significantly outnumbered Alexander. He sent Alexander a peace offer before the battle. He offered the western half of the Persian Empire enormous tribute and his daughter's hand in marriage. Alexander refused. His general Parmenio reportedly said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander replied, "And so would I if I were Parmenio." On October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies met. The night before the battle, Parmenio suggested a night attack. The Persian army was so large that surrounding it was difficult, and a night attack might reduce the numerical disadvantage. Alexander reportedly said that he did not steal victories. He slept soundly through the night before the largest battle of his life. His generals, awake and anxious, marveled at his calm. The battle itself was one of the great tactical masterpieces of the ancient world. Darius had leveled the ground for his chariots. He sent them forward early, hoping to break the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander had prepared for this. His infantry simply opened ranks, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through, while javelineers killed the horses from the sides. The Persian line was enormous, stretching far beyond Alexander's flanks on both sides. As the battle developed, the Persian left tried to swing around Alexander's right, forcing him to extend his line rightward to prevent being outflanked. This created a gap in the Persian line, a momentary opening between the Persian center and left. Alexander saw it. He wheeled the companion cavalry at the gap and charged, straight through the Persian line, straight toward Darius. He threw a spear at the King of Kings. It missed by inches. Darius fled. For the second time, the Persian king abandoned his army, his family, his empire. The Persian army, its king gone, collapsed. Alexander's cavalry swept through the disintegrating formation. The Persian losses were enormous. Alexander marched to Babylon. The city opened its gates. He marched to Susa. It surrendered. He marched to Persepolis. Part 8. Persepolis. Persepolis. The city that Darius I had built as the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the most magnificent city in the ancient Persian world. Its stone reliefs showing the tribute delegations from every corner of the empire, the carved processions of the immortals, the great audience hall where the King of Kings received the world, all of it the accumulated cultural and artistic achievement of 2 centuries of Persian imperial glory. Alexander's army sacked it. He allowed his men 3 days of looting. The population was attacked, women were raped, men were killed. The accumulated wealth of the Persian treasury, an almost incomprehensible fortune, was carried off. Ancient sources report that Alexander himself was moved by the sight of Greek slaves who had been mutilated by their Persian captors, hands cut off, noses removed, ears amputated, branded with letters, and that this contributed to his fury against the city. And then the great palace complex was burned. The ancient sources differ on why. Arrian, generally considered the most reliable historian of Alexander's campaigns, says it was a deliberate act of retribution, a sober political decision. Persepolis was burned as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BC, 150 years earlier. It was a statement to the Greek world, we came here for this. The debt is paid. Plutarch tells a different story. A drinking party in the palace of Xerxes. An Athenian courtesan named Thais, who had followed the army from Greece, stood up and proposed that the greatest act of Alexander's campaign would be to burn the palace of the king who had burned Athens. The guests cheered. Alexander seized a torch. The fire began. He is said to have regretted it the next morning. Whether planned or impulsive, the destruction of Persepolis was an immense loss. The religious works of early Zoroastrianism, written on goatskin parchment, were destroyed. Artworks, tapestries, accumulated cultural artifacts, all consumed. Dan Carlin, whose Kings of Kings series frames the Persian story from the Persian perspective, does not let us forget what this was. The greatest city in the Persian world, the embodiment of everything the Achaemenid dynasty had built over 2 centuries, burned. Alexander reportedly regretted it. He had wanted to be the heir of the Achaemenids, not their destroyer. But some things once done cannot be undone. Part 9. The death of Darius. Darius III, twice defeated in battle, twice fled, was still alive. He had retreated east after Gaugamela, toward Bactria, the eastern satrapies, where he hoped to raise another army and continue the fight. But his own nobles had lost faith. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, his own relative, moved against him. Darius was seized by his own men while fleeing. Alexander, in rapid pursuit, was closing in. When Alexander's advance cavalry finally reached the convoy, they found Darius dying in a cart. He had been stabbed by Bessus and left to die as the Bactrians fled. He died before Alexander reached him, or perhaps Alexander reached him just as he died. The accounts differ. What the accounts agree on is Alexander's response. He was saddened. This was his enemy, the man he had defeated at Issus and Gaugamela, the man who had twice fled the battlefield, the last legitimate king of kings of the Achaemenid dynasty. But he was also, in Alexander's vision of himself and his conquest, the man whose throne he was inheriting, the legitimate predecessor. Alexander covered Darius's body with his own cloak. He arranged a royal funeral. He had him buried with full honors at Persepolis beside his Achaemenid ancestors. He claimed afterwards that Darius had named him his successor while dying. Whether this was true, or whether Alexander manufactured the claim to legitimize his inheritance of the Persian throne, we cannot say. What we know is that from this point, Alexander increasingly presented himself not merely as the conqueror of Persia, but as its king, the heir of Cyrus, the continuation of the Achaemenid tradition. His generals were deeply uncomfortable with this. Part 10. Going native. The tension that was building in Alexander's army and his inner circle through the later years of the campaign is one of the most human aspects of his story. Alexander had grown up reading about Achilles. He had dreamed of divine conquest. He had a vision of himself as something beyond ordinary human limitations. His Macedonian generals and soldiers had a different vision. They were tough, practical men from a cold northern kingdom. They had followed Alexander through extraordinary hardships. They had crossed deserts and mountain ranges and rivers, and had fought battles against enemies that should have been impossible to defeat. They had done it because Alexander asked them to, and because the rewards had been extraordinary. But they were Macedonians. They had their own culture, their own ideas about how a king should behave, their own sense of what was proper. And Alexander was becoming Persian. He began wearing Persian robes. He adopted Persian court customs, the proskyneses, the deep bow of obeisance that Persian subjects performed before their king. He asked his Macedonian companions to do the same. They refused. Callisthenes, the historian who accompanied the expedition and was Aristotle's nephew, led the resistance most vocally. He argued that proskyneses was appropriate for a god and that Alexander was a man, a great man, an extraordinary man, but a man. Alexander dropped the demand for proskyneses, but the incident damaged his relationship with Callisthenes fatally. He married Roxane, the daughter of a Bactrian noble, after the conquest of Bactria. His Macedonian companions were appalled. A Persian wife, a barbarian queen, a rejection of the Greek and Macedonian identity that they had fought under. He executed Philotas, one of his most senior commanders, son of the great general Parmenio, on charges of conspiracy. Whether the conspiracy was real or manufactured to eliminate a political rival, historians still debate. He then sent men to kill Parmenio himself before the old general could hear of his son's death and react. Parmenio, who had served Philip before Alexander, who had been at every major battle of the campaign, who had argued for caution and compromise at every stage, was killed by his own king's order. And then there was Cleitus the Black. Part 11, The Murder of Cleitus. The death of Cleitus the Black is one of the most disturbing moments in Alexander's story, and one of the most revealing. Cleitus was a senior Macedonian officer who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. He had cut down a Persian nobleman who was about to kill Alexander from behind. He was brave, loyal, and honest in the way that long-serving veterans sometimes are. At a drinking party in Samarkand in 328 BC, Cleitus made the mistake of being honest. He was drunk, Alexander was drunk. The conversation turned, as it apparently sometimes did in Alexander's court, to comparisons between Alexander and Philip, Alexander's father, the king who had created the army and the kingdom that made Alexander's conquests possible. Alexander had, apparently, a complicated need to be greater than his father, to be told that his achievements surpassed Philip's. His companions had learned to provide this reassurance. Cleitus did not. He told Alexander that his victories were won by Macedonian soldiers, not by himself alone. He quoted Euripides. He reminded Alexander that it was his own hand that had saved his life at the Granicus. Alexander flew into a rage. He grabbed a spear from one of his guards. He killed Cleitus. He drove the spear through him, and Cleitus fell dead in the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander stared at what he had done. He pulled the spear from the body. He tried to turn it on himself. His guards restrained him. He went to his tent and did not emerge for 3 days. He wept. He refused food. His companions were genuinely afraid for him, not just politically, but for his sanity, his life. He emerged eventually. The official explanation was given. It had been the drink, the anger of the moment, an accident of war. The court moved on. But something had been revealed. The rage that Alexander was capable of. The instability beneath the extraordinary self-control and the military genius. The way that the belief in his own divinity was making it increasingly difficult for him to accept the kind of honest counsel that any leader needs. He needed people around him who would tell him the truth. He was destroying the people who would. Part 12. The Edge of the World. After the consolidation of Persia and the eastern satrapies, Alexander pushed further into Bactria and Sogdia, what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. Brutal guerrilla warfare against opponents who melted into the mountains and came back the next season. It took 2 years to pacify at enormous cost. And then India. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains into what is now Pakistan, the easternmost edge of the former Persian Empire, and far beyond it. He fought the most difficult battle of his entire campaign at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC. His opponent was the Indian king Porus, a man of extraordinary personal presence, reportedly 7 feet tall, who fought from an elephant. Porus's army included over 200 war elephants. Alexander had never faced elephants in battle in such numbers. He found a way. He crossed the Hyphasis at night in a thunderstorm, concealed the crossing through diversionary maneuvers, and engaged Porus's army from an unexpected direction. The battle was brutal. The Macedonian cavalry could not approach the elephants directly, the horses would not go near them. New tactics had to be improvised, with javelins and pikes used against the elephant corps at close range. They won. Porus was captured. And then Alexander did something characteristic. He asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Like a king, Porus replied. Alexander restored his kingdom and made him an ally. He wanted to keep going east. His scouts reported more kingdoms, more rivers, more enemies to defeat. His army refused. At the Hyphasis River, the last river before the great plain of the Ganges, his soldiers sat down and would not move. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They were in a country they did not recognize, far from home, in rain that seemed to never stop. Alexander tried everything. He appealed. He raged. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, hoping they would relent. They did not. He gave the order to turn back. The ancient sources say he wept, not from sadness, but from the frustration of a man who could see further than the edge of the world his men were willing to follow him to. Part 13. The journey back. The return from India was almost as costly as the advance. Alexander led his army back through the Gedrosian desert, the inhospitable wasteland of what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. It was a decision his generals questioned. A more northerly route would have been safer if longer. Some historians believe it was a deliberate punishment of his army for refusing to follow him to the Ganges. Others believe it was a strategic decision to open a coastal route and establish supply points for future campaigns. Whatever the reason, the Gedrosian crossing was devastating. Thirst and heat and the utter harshness of the terrain killed thousands of soldiers and even more camp followers. Women and children who had followed the army died in the desert. It was one of the greatest disasters of the campaign, and it was almost entirely avoidable. He emerged from the desert transformed. The extraordinary physical stamina that had sustained him through years of campaigning was beginning to falter. He had been wounded multiple times. An arrow had pierced his lung in India, a serious wound from which he had recovered more slowly than any previous injury. He began drinking more heavily. He began to plan new campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, a circumnavigation of Africa, further expansion that would make his empire truly global. And then Hephaestion died. Part 14. Hephaestion. Hephaestion was Alexander's closest companion from childhood, his Patroclus, the man who had run with him to the tomb of Achilles' companion at Troy, who had been present at every major moment of the campaign, who was, by most accounts, the person Alexander loved most in the world. He died in Ecbatana in 324 BC, of a fever, or possibly of excessive drinking, or possibly of both. He was 32 years old. Alexander's grief was extreme beyond anything his companions had seen. He ordered mourning across the empire. He crucified the physician who had failed to save Hephaestion. He cut his own hair, as Achilles had cut his in grief for Patroclus. He fasted for days. He sent to the oracle of Ammon asking whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The oracle replied that he could be worshipped as a divine hero, a lesser status than a god. Alexander accepted this grudgingly. He ordered funeral games in Hephaestion's honor, the largest since the funeral of Patroclus in the Iliad. 3,000 performers came from across the empire. The grief did not pass, it deepened. He buried himself in planning, in the campaigns that would follow Hephaestion's death, in the drinking that had become, by this point, a serious problem. He moved to Babylon to organize the Arabian campaign. Omens multiplied. His Babylonian priests warned him not to enter the city, the auspices were bad. He ignored them. Part 15, Babylon. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon. He was 32 years old. He had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. He had been king for 13 years. He had never lost a battle. He was planning an invasion of Arabia. After Arabia, Africa perhaps, or further west through Carthage into the western Mediterranean. His ambitions had not shrunk. If anything, the death of Hephaestion had given them a feverish urgency, as if he were racing towards something or away from something. In late May 323 BC, after a dinner party and a night of heavy drinking, Alexander fell ill. What followed over the next 10 days is one of the most debated medical mysteries in ancient history. A fever, increasing weakness, pain, difficulty swallowing. By the end of the first week, he could not speak. His soldiers, the veterans who had followed him from Macedonia to India and back, crowded outside the palace asking to see him. They were afraid he was already dead and being hidden from them. Alexander ordered that they be allowed to pass through his room. He could not speak. He could only move his eyes and his hand slightly as each soldier passed. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. What killed him has been debated ever since. Typhoid fever complicated by alcohol abuse is the most common modern medical explanation. Some historians have argued for poisoning Antipater, whom Alexander had summoned to Babylon and who may have feared what awaited him there, is sometimes named. The ancient sources mention poison, but do not agree on whether it was administered or simply the accumulated toxicity of years of heavy drinking. We do not know. When his generals gathered around his deathbed and asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander is reported to have said, "To the strongest." Some sources say he said, "To the best." They were the last words of the man who had conquered the world. Part 16, the question. What was Alexander? Dan Carlin's Kings of Kings series frames the Achaemenid story partly from the Persian perspective, asking us to see the empire that Alexander destroyed on its own terms, to understand what was lost as well as what was gained. From the Persian perspective, Alexander was a destroyer. He burned Persepolis. He ended a dynasty that had built the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had seen. The Persians of later centuries called him Alexander the Accursed. Some still do. From the Greek perspective, he was the culmination of the Greek project, the man who spread Greek culture across the known world, who created the Hellenistic civilization that would eventually transmit Greek philosophy and art and science to Rome and through Rome to the modern world. From his own perspective, which is the most interesting one, he was trying to be something that had never existed before. Not a Greek king ruling over conquered barbarians, not a Persian king of kings, something new, a fusion, a universal king who could claim legitimate authority over every people and every tradition because he had absorbed them all. He was, the historian Peter Green has argued, trying to create a world state, a single political entity that would bring the diverse peoples of the ancient world under a single authority that respected their diversity rather than erasing it. In this, he was the heir of Cyrus as much as of Philip. He failed. The empire he built lasted, in unified form, approximately 1 day after his death. His generals immediately began dividing it, fighting over the pieces, establishing the successor kingdoms that would fragment his achievement into the Hellenistic world. But the cultural impact lasted for centuries. The Greek language spread across the Near East and the Mediterranean. The Hellenistic civilization that Alexander's conquests created was the world into which Christianity would later spread, the world whose philosophical tradition Rome would inherit and transmit. Alexander changed the world. He changed it for better and for worse in ways that are still being debated. He was 32 years old when it ended. In 13 years of campaigning, he had conquered more of the earth than any human being before him. He never lost a battle. He wept when there were no more worlds to conquer. Part 17. What remained? The body of Alexander was eventually taken to Alexandria, the city he had founded in Egypt, and buried there in a magnificent tomb. Caesar visited it. Augustus visited it. Caligula reportedly took the breastplate from the body as a trophy. The tomb has never been found. His mother Olympias survived him by only a few years, dying as we have described in her own story, stoned to death by the mob that Cassander sent against her. His son Alexander IV was murdered as a child by Cassander. The Macedonian royal bloodline of Alexander the Great died with him. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, fought each other for decades over the pieces of his empire. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last 3 centuries, ending with Cleopatra, whose story we have already told. Seleucus took Asia. Antigonus took Macedonia. Their wars shaped the world for a generation. The Persian Empire as a political entity was gone, but Persian culture survived, absorbed into the Hellenistic world that Alexander had created, persisting through the Parthian and later the Sasanian empires, eventually producing the Islamic civilization that would conquer the Middle East and Central Asia centuries later. Roxane and her son were killed. Hephaestion was worshipped as a divine hero briefly, before being quietly forgotten. The horse Bucephalus, Alexander's great black stallion, who had carried him from Macedonia to India, had died in the Punjab at the age of about 30. Alexander founded a city in his name. Bucephala, a city named for a horse. It is one of the most touching details of Alexander's story. Among all the cities he founded, all the monuments he built, all the empires he conquered, a city for his horse. Closing the fire 18 night. And so the story of Alexander the Great comes to rest. 32 years, from the boy at Pella reading the Iliad under the stars, to the man in Babylon who could no longer speak, moving his eyes to acknowledge the soldiers passing through his room one last time. He had done what he promised himself he would do. He had been Achilles. He had chosen the short, glorious life over the long, obscure one. Whether that was wisdom or madness, whether the world was better or worse for what he did, these are questions that do not have simple answers. What is certain is that he was extraordinary, that the combination of military genius and physical courage and restless intellectual energy and absolute certainty of his own destiny that he brought to the world was something that appeared once and never quite appeared again. He conquered the Persian Empire. He stood at the tomb of Cyrus and wept. He burned Persepolis and reportedly regretted it the next morning. He killed his friend Cleitus in a drunken rage and wept for 3 days. He grieved for Hephaestion with the grief of Achilles for Patroclus. He was human always. For all his belief in his own divinity, all his desperate reaching toward the transcendence that the Iliad had promised was available to the greatest of men, he was human, brilliant and flawed and finally mortal. Let those images settle now, like dust on the plain of Gaugamela. The boy running to the tomb of Achilles at Troy, the young king at the front of the cavalry charge at the Granicus, nearly dying in the first hour of the campaign, the torch passing from hand to hand at Persepolis as the greatest city in Persia begins to burn, the tears at the Hyphasis River when the army would not follow, the eyes moving one last time as the veterans of India and Afghanistan and Persia and Egypt filed past the bed in Babylon. Let the names grow quiet. Alexander, Olympias, Philip, Hephaestion, Darius, Roxane, Bucephalus. The boy who read the Iliad and decided to live it. There are no more worlds to conquer tonight. No more rivers to cross, no more deserts to march through, no more battles to win. Only the ancient dark. And sleeper. A soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.